Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Royal United Services Institute, and I'm going to be chairing this event. And it's a great pleasure for me to do so. It's one of the important inputs to a project which Rory has been working on over the last year, looking at the impact of UK policy, a range of policy instruments, aid, trade, diplomacy and defence, with reference to Eastern Africa, the Horn and East Africa, and specifically Sudan, Somalia, Kenya and Ethiopia. And goodness, there's a lot happening in every one of those countries right now. But the purpose of this discussion is very much to try and understand what is happening in that region, but also trying to understand what the UK is doing in that region and how useful, how appropriate its policy is and how it's managed to join up its approach across government or indeed not. And of course, this period has been a period of turmoil in the region, most notably recently the horrors of the civil war within Ethiopia. But it's also been a period of turmoil in the UK with successive changes in Prime Minister, with the merger between the FCO and DFID, and of course the significant cuts in the ODA budget, which most recently exacerbated by the diversion of funds to domestic refugee protection. So a lot happening on the UK side as well. And the challenge for this seminar, I think, is to bring together those two sets of developments. So for that purpose, I think I could think of no better pair of speakers to get us into the issue. The first is Mary Harper, the very long-standing director for Africa at the BBC, and absolutely delighted for her, the Africa editor, I should say, for the BBC. And secondly, we have Rory Stewart, former International Development Secretary, and indeed at one stage a contender to be our Prime Minister. It might have been a rather different situation on this issue and many others if you had succeeded in that, Rory. But that is a counterfactual, as so much speculation is. So the format of this seminar is that I will, after my initial remarks, I'm going to ask Mary to make some initial remarks of her own, and then Rory to do the same. And then we'll have a conversation between the three of us on the issues that have been raised for around 30 to 40 minutes. We'll see how that goes. And then we're going to throw the discussion open to our audience. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom program in front of you. And I will endeavor to cover all your questions. I may combine something. We'll see how many we've got. I know 400 people signed up for this event. I can't yet see how many people are now participating, but I imagine it's a very large number. We will try to get through as many questions as possible, and we will finish by 14:30 at the latest. We may finish a little earlier. We'll see how the conversation goes. And maybe the final remark to make is that this event is fully on the record, both the initial presentations and the Q&A, and it is being recorded and I think being live streamed at this moment. So without further ado, can I ask Mary to get us started, please?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and welcome everybody to this event. I thought I'd just very briefly at the beginning, as I spend so much time in East and the Horn of Africa, talk about people's perceptions of the UK very briefly and then focus on the situation on the ground. And I must say, I've been reporting on Africa, particularly this region, for more than 30 years now. And I don't think that I've ever seen so many simultaneous crises affecting this part of Africa. I was trying to think if I could think of another time, and I don't think I can in those past 3 decades. And also, as time progresses, geopolitical position of East and the Horn of Africa, particularly the countries with maritime borders, is increasingly globally important. In terms of the perceptions from the ground on the UK, I was asked to do a similar talk to the British ambassadors in Africa who'd come to the Foreign Office for some kind of away day. And I could tell by their faces that they really did not like what I had to say. Because from my encounters with people across the region, their perception is that the role and the importance of the UK is in decline. Obviously, this is anecdotal, but this is the general sway of conversations. And also the UK is being taken less seriously. It's become something of a joke, partly because of the recent political dramas. People say, well, how can the UK lecture us about things like democracy when the situation in the UK is worse than it is in our countries? And they liken the recent rapid succession of prime ministers to last year's double coup in Burkina Faso. They say that the possible intervention of the IMF during the recent crisis is a bit like structural adjustment programs of the 1980s. So they're like, in a way, like Britain is becoming like Africa at its worst in some ways. And there's also, people seem to be very perplexed about Brexit for lots of reasons, but it is at a time of expanding regional integration in the Horn and East of Africa, with organizations like the East Africa Community growing. So they're like, why is Britain going in the opposite direction? And quite often when you go to embassies in Africa, there are these posters kind of glamorizing this marvelous new global Britain. And I've heard many, many jokes from people who go into embassies and see these, and they don't take them very, very seriously. And another recent thing that has upset and perplexed people, and I suppose I'm saying this partly because I work there, are these very significant cuts to the World Service and other parts of the BBC in a very significant amount of jobs and roles and programs that go out to Africa are being closed. So now I will, at the same time as people sort of say Britain is a joke and it doesn't matter anymore, when Britain doesn't get very involved in things like the war in Tigray or respond to the drought across the region, people just, they complain about that as well. They're like, there's a song by Michael Jackson that people keep sending me called "They Don't Care About Us." So even though it's a sort of contradictory perspective anyway on the UK. And as far as the situation on the ground is concerned, as I said at the beginning, I really can't think of a time when I've seen the whole region so badly affected. And in fact, when we were first supposed to give this talk, I was thinking, well, Somaliland is not a country as such, but it has a pretty stable situation and a pretty functioning kind of democracy. But even Somaliland now is in a situation of extreme political crisis. So it seems there's nobody left, at least in the Horn of Africa, that can be described as stable. You have Kenya, which is pretty stable. But I think there's one problem here, is that because Ethiopia, which was this balance to Kenya, and I think the fact that those two countries were these kind of rocks of stability to one degree or another, now that you don't have Ethiopia anymore, I think it could be a problem. In terms of security, I think the most frightening part of all of this is Ethiopia, and it's not just the situation in Tigray, which, even though now there's some kind of peace accord, there are various elements to that conflict that were not involved in the peace accord, namely the Eritreans and various regional forces, such as that ethnic Amhara regional forces. And because they're still very much embedded in that conflict, it's difficult to see how a genuine peace is going to be achieved. And I think Ethiopia and Sudan we can bring into this similar kind of situation where both of those countries have had extremely autocratic or dictatorial leaderships for decades. Ethiopia for centuries because of the previous situation, the previous empires that existed there. And then so quickly, this lid has been taken off the cauldron, and it's like all the boiling water is just spilling out everywhere. And I do feel that even though the direction looks like it could be positive, the way in which it's happening is leading to more deaths, more destruction, more economic paralysis than previously, when they had more autocratic governments. And a sort of worrying indication of this weakness is that in Ethiopia, ever since Al-Shabaab in Somalia came into existence, its prime target was always Ethiopia, and Ethiopia managed to hold it back. And recently, a few months ago, Al-Shabaab invaded Ethiopia. It went 150 kilometers within Ethiopian territory. And that was just an indication of how weak Ethiopia is and how disturbing groups can take advantage of that situation. And I'm quite often in contact with Al-Shabaab, and they were like, we just cross our arms now and look at Ethiopia destroying itself. We don't even need to do that much to disrupt it. When we look at Somalia, which is the country that I spend a great deal of time in and have a special interest, there is now some possibly positive moves in terms of the conflict. There's a new president, there's a new strategy whereby they're trying to defeat Al-Shabaab on three fronts: militarily, ideologically, and financially. And the region the area that has had the most success recently is the military one. And I think it's because of a combination of local militias, the people who've been living under Al-Shabaab for about 15 years now. They're finally rising up against them, partly because they can't afford to pay taxes in the situation of drought. And then you have the African forces now called ATMIS, you have Somali army, other regional armies, and also you do have now a sort of revived activity by the American special forces, particularly their drone attacks, which are really very effective. So it's possible that the tide is turning, but unless these newly liberated areas can be held onto, and that's really complicated. You need forces on the ground in a very difficult environment. Unless they can hold on to that territory, Al-Shabaab will do its usual pattern of just moving back into those areas, and it's already beginning to happen. So I would say that it's very fragile. Alongside these conflicts that are really across the whole region, we also have the worst drought in more than 40 years. And as somebody who spends a lot of time in that region, to see, number one, camels dying, because camels, they can withstand a lot of very harsh conditions, and seeing camels dying, or seeing trucks loaded with camels in the back, people driving their camels to some possible source of grazing and water, that just shows the extent of this particular drought. And it seems like, from what people say, the whole pastoralist nomadic way of existence is really under threat. And a lot of people who've lived as nomads, they're giving up because they can't afford to replenish their livestock. And with multiple droughts, it's just impossible to carry on. So there's a very big drift to the urban centres. Mogadishu is said to be the world's second fastest growing city, but that could also be an opportunity if jobs can be found for these young, very entrepreneurial people. And some countries are already seeing this opportunity. Even in places like Somalia, you get China's now quite interested, Turkey, the Gulf states. So even though it looks like a total catastrophe, there are a lot of opportunities. And I will just end by saying that even though there is this the attitudes towards the UK are changing. I do feel that the UK does have some very unique things to offer in terms of language, education, time zone. Okay, the colonial history is complicated, but there is some residual relationships and respect for British institutions. So, and also the British armed forces, I find, compared to quite a lot of other foreign forces, they seem to be, in general, of course, there's lots of exceptions, but more respected than a lot of the other ones. So the UK does have a lot to offer, but it feels at the moment as if it's throwing away opportunities. Thank you very much.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. That really rich presentation, getting us off to a great start. I won't even attempt to summarize it, but you gave us a real sense of the complexity of the region, but also I think ended on an optimistic note, which is really important, because in the end, economic development and taking advantage of the skills of the younger generations coming through is going to be absolutely key to the long-term stability and prosperity of all the countries in the region. So, Rory, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to try to speak briefly about both Africa and the United Kingdom. And the center of my presentation is going to be the moment when the UK developed an Africa strategy. And an Africa strategy which still theoretically is controlled by the National Security Council and is supposed to still define our approach to Africa. And this was brought together the end of 2016 into 2017. And it was an attempt to answer some of the challenges which Mary has raised, in particular, Britain's increasing retreat from Africa, which was quite dramatic by 2016, 2017, and attempted to turn that around using, at that stage, Britain's very, very large international development budget. Britain's development budget at the time was nearly $20 billion a year. And of that, almost half was spent in different forms in Africa. So the Africa strategy took a snapshot of the situation, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa at that moment, and attempted to craft a strategic response. And I think looking back at it 5 years on, it's very revealing how much we got wrong and how quickly the world is changing. So the strategy, I think, was signed off finally in the National Security Council at the very beginning of 2018. And to fast forward to what the strategy included, it included a big commitment to more financial investment in Africa. There was a big investment conference, which the Prime Minister attended at the beginning of 2018, which included lending money and the private sector and City of London getting involved in Africa. It included an attempt to increase the number of diplomatic staff in Africa by 400, very dramatic increase in the number of diplomatic staff. There was investment in more language learning. There was the reopening of new embassies. There was a renewed emphasis on the Commonwealth and on the Sahel. So Sahel in particular involved the opening of 2 new embassies and the deployment of British troops up to the Sahel. And the argument at the time was twofold. There was and to some extent, Mary has anticipated this because it continues to be the argument around Africa and probably has been for 60 or 70 years. On the one hand, the problems of Africa, potential threats posed by Africa, and on the other hand, the extraordinary strengths and opportunities of Africa. And this tends to be the way in which Western countries have viewed the continent for a very, very long time. So in terms of the threats at the time, they were perceived as being threats of migration. Remember, this was not long after the big uptick in refugees crossing the Mediterranean in boats. Security threats, potential threats from Al-Shabaab and other Islamist groups, but generally conflict across the continent. And finally, a real perception that Africa found itself trapped in very difficult situations in relation to climate and extreme poverty. Those were the things that the strategy was supposed to be addressing on the negative side. On the positive side, the story of Africa, of course, was always the incredible untapped potential. Untapped potential, of course, in terms of natural resources, So we talk a great deal about the fact that Africa is a very, very major world source of the objects that go into our telephones, the objects that go into our electric cars, particular lithium, copper, cobalt, things that come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but also Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, that it is potentially the great labor force of the world. 1 in 10 children born in the world will be born in Nigeria by 2050. And perhaps 40% of the population of the world will be African by the end of the century. So theoretically, Africa was supposed to be providing the labor to match the capital from the developed world, and this would be its path to growth. And in 2016, we were still very much influenced and inflected by this extraordinary period of the 2000s, which appeared to be an extraordinary miracle decade. And there are many ways of picking this up. McKinsey wrote a famous paper called The African Economic Miracle in 2010. The Economist magazine famously turned on its head from a very gloomy piece in 2000 to a very cheerful piece in 2010. And it really looked as though Africa was an extraordinary, had an extraordinary commercial and economic future. There had also been, during the period from 1990 through to 2010, a total transformation in the democracies of Africa, very large emergence of new democratic states, increasing adherence apparently to Western norms on human rights and electoral processes. And although there remained a few outliers, even some of those seemed to be moving. So in 2017, to the relief of the world, Robert Mugabe eventually was no longer the ruler in Zimbabwe. And there was a great deal of temporary hope that Emerson Mnangagwa would be able to usher in a new period for Zimbabwe that people have been worried about since 1980. All of that now looks pretty peculiar from 2 dimensions. Pretty peculiar, obviously, from the dimension of Africa itself. So if you were to do a presentation on Africa today, of course, you would begin by talking, as Mary did, about many of the multiple tragedies that Africa is facing. Clearly, it was clear by the end of that decade that Somalia, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, a lot of the Sahel, Eastern DRC remained in a very difficult situation in terms of armed conflict. Climate change has become more and more extreme. We're now in the 4th year of an extreme drought on the Horn and the worst drought in 40 years in some parts of East Africa. And as Mary's described with her witnessing what's happened to camels in Somalia, it is repeated, not always blanket, sometimes actually quite strikingly, for example, in Kilifi in Kenya, in quite a localized fashion. You can get very extreme climate reactions happening in one community and 15 miles away have a quite different climate event. And at the same time, of course, we have floods happening in Western Central Africa, landslides happening in Uganda, much of this triggered by climate change, and extreme storms happening in Mozambique and Malawi. Right? So natural disasters, conflict, but perhaps the most dramatic change of all has been in the economic trajectory of Africa. And here we go back to some of the fundamentals that maybe in 2016 Britain was not really focusing on. At the moment where we were feeling very, very optimistic and telling a very cheerful story about the direction in which Africa was going, there were many reasons already to be concerned. If you look at Africa's GDP per capita growth from 1960 to 2016, it was very, very disappointing compared to South Asia, and particularly compared to East Asia. So in 1960, in South Asia, GDP per capita was about $300 per capita. And at that point, GDP per capita in Africa was nearly 4 times more, about $1,200 per capita. Fast forward to 2016, as this Africa strategy came together, GDP per capita in South Asia had risen to $1,600, and it had only risen to $1,600 in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, sub-Saharan Africa had gone from being 4 times wealthier in GDP per capita terms to being at the same level. And compared to East Asia, it was even more dramatic. Went from being about the same level as East Asia in 1960 to a period in 2016 when GDP per capita in East Asia had reached $10,000 and was still stuck at $1,600 in Africa. In other words, over that same period, East Asia had managed to achieve 5 times greater GDP per capita growth. This means, secondly, that Britain's deployments then found itself in its own multiple series of problems, which Mary gestured at, and those include the massive cutting of the development budget, which in effect means in many African countries, and it's very difficult to get your hands on the figures, so a lot of this is me talking to ambassadors on the ground, but in many of the countries where I oversaw bilateral development budgets of $85, $90 million, we're now down at $15 or $20 million. In other words, it's reduced by 4/5. And to put that in context, I'm now the president of a nonprofit called Give Directly, and our own individual programs funded by philanthropists in some of these countries are now larger than the entire British government programs in those countries. We're a larger bilateral donor now than the United Kingdom. Very, very striking and in some sense quite shocking. And the final thing, I think, is the calculations about how to balance China were thrown off by President Biden's policy reviews on international strategy, which led to a very, very peculiar decision by the Boris Johnson government to effectively try to emulate a tilt towards Asia, which took, at exactly the wrong moment, the focus off Europe, famously. There's very little in that Strategic Defense Review about thinking about a land war in Europe, but also took a lot of focus off Africa and reversed the traditional principle which existed in the Cold War, that the way to balance a strategic adversary was to invest globally. Instead, the idea was to put more and more resources into East Asia. At the same time, China, of course, has increased its investment very dramatically. China at the moment is on course to increase its imports from Africa to $300 billion by 2025. It continues to spend from its own formal development banks alone, that's not counting Chinese companies, twice as much as the combined spend of Europe and the United States. And this then feeds into the final bit, which is just as we were trying to encourage the City of London to get more involved in China and use all the trillions in the City of London to get the economy of Africa going, that 5 years later also looks very awkward because Africa now finds itself in a debt crisis driven by a lot of private lending. Private lending, which didn't actually in the end come much from the City of London because the City of London was more skeptical about the economic potential of Africa than the British government, but came primarily from China, India, and Turkey. These were not concessional loans, these were private loans, often on floating interest rates. Debt servicing in Africa has now tripled from 5% to 15% of expenditure on average. That's exceeding all the expenditure in African states on education, health, and social protection. 2/3 of countries in Africa are now in extreme debt distress. Debt has gone from $380 billion in 2012 to $702 billion today. And we're now going into a whole conversation around debt restructuring. And it's in this process that we also have to think about the fact that Africa has a very different relationship with the West from the relationship that it had 40 years ago. It has much less commitment to Western norms. There's much less, as it were, deference, or much less, if you were going to be brutal, obedience to the kinds of requests that the United States, France, or Britain try to bring to their partners. A deep distrust based around narratives around decolonization and slavery, which means that a lot of traditional international development programs are now seen with much more skepticism. And I think it's a world in which, and this is one of the reasons that I work with this organization, Give Directly, and why we do direct unconditional cash transfer to the poorest communities, is because we increasingly feel that it's one of the only ways of having a relationship with Africa from the West, which genuinely respects the dignity and independence of recipients, gives them the choice rather than getting stuck back in some of the patronizing cycles that have been repeated again and again over the last tragic 6 decades of Western interaction with sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rory. 2 fantastic presentations, and I thought you you brought the flavour of that optimistic moment a few years ago out very well, and then the disappointment we've heard since. I mean, let me just raise a number of questions for both of you. I think that both of them actually are ones which you might both interestingly comment on. I think, Rory, you made that very important point, comparing the sub-Saharan African experience in GDP levels with South Asia and the Indo-Pacific. But there are some African countries, some sub-Saharan African countries over the last 2 to 3 decades, which have done better than others. There's quite a big variety in experience. And certainly Ethiopia and to maybe a lesser extent, but a significant extent, Kenya, have been relatively good performers for most of this period. And indeed, I believe Ethiopia was the largest recipient of UK bilateral aid for quite a number of years, and an aid darling for the World Bank and others. Just talk to me a little bit. Maybe I could ask Mary the question first, and then to Rory about that period. Was it always a false prospectus to see Ethiopia as a real potential success story? Was it always a very high risk strategy? So this is a reflection on UK, but maybe more broadly Western policy towards that country up until the Abe's coming to power and everything that unraveled after that. So Mary and then Rory.
I don't think it was a mistake or a misconception at the time. And I mean, I know it's controversial, but Ethiopia was being governed by a dictator, an autocrat, Meles Zenawi. But maybe you needed that in such a complicated country with more than 80 ethnic groups and 3 or 4 competing and hostile to each other large ethnic groups. Even though people were living, they were cowed in lots of ways, they were scared of authority. There was always, you couldn't really have open conversations with people unless you're in their houses. And even in their houses, sometimes they were like, somebody in this house is probably a spy. So there was quite a lot of fear. But if you looked at the way that the 5-year plans that were being executed in terms of the economy, it was extraordinary to see the transformation of that country. And of course, there's still very poor parts of Ethiopia. It wasn't a blanket improvement, but areas around Addis Ababa and other big cities like Awassa with industrial parks where you'd have companies like Tommy Hilfiger, H&M, very high class leather companies coming in, obviously lots of Chinese companies. And you looked at the infrastructural development in terms of roads in particular. Like sometimes I used to drive when it was safer from Somaliland to Addis. And you drive this road from Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland, to the border, which takes a long time because it's very rough. And then you literally arrive at the border, and then there is this incredible road that goes all the way to Addis. And it was completely transformational. I always think people kind of underestimate roads and what they can do to development. So I don't think it was misconceived, but at the same time, as I said before, Ethiopia had got massive internal problems. And perhaps this whole idea of ethnic nationalism, where each group was given sort of a lot of autonomy, it separated them out from each other. And so it kind of accentuated the rivalries and the bitterness, because the ethnic groups was that they were the building blocks of that country, a design of Meles Zenawi. So it was always fragile. And the fact that when Abiy came, there was an explosion across the country, and all this pent up hatred and resentment just exploded. But I think Ethiopia could have gone another way if the the sort of more liberal political sphere had been done much more slowly and more carefully, then maybe Ethiopia could slowly be developing into a freer country, but also holding on to that extraordinary economic transformation.
Very interesting. And I'm very interested in your thoughts on what Mary said, Rory. And in particular, I think you put quite a lot of focus in historical trends and on democratization and spreading of what I think you called Western political norms. But the experience of Sudan and Ethiopia, which Mary has commented on, is that you lift the lid in a process that appears initially to be one of liberalization and democratization, and the chances for explosion are very high, which is, of course, not only an African experience. So what's your reflection? Should we have seen this coming in Ethiopia, and was there anything that could have been done about it?
It's difficult to know. I mean, you're absolutely right. Ethiopia was a great success story, and probably Ethiopia and Rwanda were the two most dramatic success stories of that period, because obviously their experience in Rwanda's case of the genocide and in Ethiopia's case of the terrible starvation in the 1980s made them probably the most dramatic examples of sustained economic growth. And they were achieving growth rates higher than Kenya's growth rate through that period. But they were, of course, authoritarian regimes. And one of the question marks, obviously, in the back of the minds of Western political scientists throughout this period is how robust these were, how fragile, what would happen when a transition happened, whether this type of strange combination of, on the one hand, what Stefan Durkon, who's a very distinguished development economist at Oxford, would call an elite commitment to development. In other words, a sense in both Ethiopia and Rwanda that the key figures at the top of the government and a lot of the key figures within the private sector, within civil society, shared a joint commitment to development, which is absent, for example, in places like Nigeria, dramatically absent in places like Nigeria. But that was combined, of course, with political systems which were very opaque and were not really open in the way in which people expected. And this created a series of difficulties for the sort of logic that applied right the way through from about 1989 to 2005, which was the old story, which goes right back to modernization theorists in the 1950s, which is that democracy and economic growth are natural bedfellows, and that if you chart it over 200 years, that the most successful economies in the world have been democracies. And of course, that fell to pieces when China broke through what was supposed to be the ceiling on the kind of growth or sustained growth that could be achieved by an autocratic state, and demonstrated that it was able to continue to grow very, very fast without that kind of liberalization. And the story of Ethiopia is part of a much bigger story, which is that 2005 turns out also to have been the moment between 1989 and 2005 where the number of democracies in the world doubled. But in 2005, that number froze. And from 2005, and particularly from 2014-16 onwards, began to drop very dramatically. So now in the world, sort of Freedom House surveys, etc., would, instead of having 40% of the countries being listed as free, which is where we were in 2005, we're now down to about 20%. And paradoxically, some of the, in some ways, most attractive regimes politically to the West, such as the government in Malawi, very popular president, a peaceful country without conflict, but $15 billion of investment in Malawi over the last 15 years has not led to any reduction in poverty. Right? So these, and of course, these paradoxes are things that African voters and African rulers are incredibly aware of. And both in some of their political abstentions around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of the relationships between countries like Zimbabwe and China, or Congo and China, you can see people increasingly insulating themselves against the West and playing one side off against another. And I think the challenge for the United States and Europe and Britain as allies is to find out what the relationship they can offer with Africa, which both sits in line with our own values, is acceptable to new African governments that are not prepared to be patronized, and which differentiates us from China. And that doesn't mean, I think, trying to get into the business of competing with China on infrastructure and mining. I think it involves thinking about very different development approaches.
No, thank you very much indeed for that, Rory. I think, and in relation to your Freedom House ranking point, of course, there's a growing number of countries which are classified as partly free. So they're not totalitarian regimes, but nor are they democracies in a Western model. And maybe part of what's happening is, as we move further and further away from the colonial period, we're getting a greater diversity of political models, which they're not necessarily suitable, but they grow out of the history and experience and indeed the diversity of individual countries rather than universal models. So really interesting point there. Could I ask both of you to reflect a little bit about what the impact has been of the two global crises that we've seen over the last couple of years? On the one hand, the COVID pandemic and all the disruption that's caused. And on the other hand, of course, the war in Ukraine, and not so much perhaps the diplomatic side of it, although that is important, but also the food and energy crisis associated with that. How far have developments in this region been affected by those two crises? Mary, do you want to start?
Sure, and I'll start with Ukraine. Partly because in the Horn of Africa, where we have got this appalling drought, and where, for example, a humanitarian appeal for that region that was launched earlier this year, by April, it had only obtained 4% of the funds that were requested. Now that amount has gone up, but it's not 100%. And there is very much a kind of anger, I would say, in Africa with the media, with the international attention. People are saying, look, that this war in Tigray is the most costly war in human lives that's happening now, but nobody is really very interested and they don't really care. All the focus is on Ukraine. And then I think the most alarming thing about it is that in some Horn of Africa countries, about 90% of their wheat imports come from Russia and Ukraine. So that in a period of drought, when their own cereal production is devastated, the grain that they could have imported from those countries dried up for a large amount of time, plus fuel prices. So you get the cost of these absolutely basic products going up about 3 times in some countries. And so that has been, particularly at this time of drought, a real hard-hitting war in Europe that has taken attention, funding, and pushed up prices. So that has been very hard on those countries. In terms of COVID, there have been, I mean, Africa was interesting in terms of COVID because quite a lot of countries were not as badly affected as other parts of the world. So even though there were lots of information campaigns and other efforts to try to prevent COVID from spreading, actually it wasn't in a lot of countries so devastating. But of course, because of resources being transferred and supply chain problems, it has had very negative effects. And just one example of this is measles inoculations, because so much has been focusing on the COVID vaccines and COVID prevention. The measles campaign has really dropped off. And in fact, measles is the biggest killer of children in Africa. So it skewed the health care on the continent to a detrimental effect.
Really interesting. Thank you very much, Mary. Rory?
Yeah, so the impact of COVID in Africa has been mixed. And the vast majority of cases were focused on a relatively small number of countries, I think 90% of the cases in about 8 countries in Africa. But the most profound impact of COVID has been on the economies of Africa. In almost every case, there's been a significant drop in GDP, and in almost every case, poverty has increased. And I think what makes Africa an extreme outlier at the moment is in relation to extreme poverty. Statistics from Africa are not very easy, but approximately 220 million people lived in extreme poverty in Africa in 1980. And approximately twice the number in absolute terms live in extreme poverty in Africa today. And this is a very, it's very shameful, and it also makes Africa very distinct from the rest of the world. It is in Africa where you will still find 3/4 the instance of the world of people who are living in single-room mud dwellings with no proper roof, with no access, in many cases, to electricity, no livestock, no resilience, the most minimal possible cash income, where children will not be going to school because although school is theoretically free in a place like Kenya, in practice, it's very difficult to go to a government school unless you provide some money to do so. Where in Malawi, the average class size is over 100 students per teacher. And many of these schools will not have blackboards or chalk. There and in other countries in Africa, in fact, many countries in Africa, laws have been passed requiring the tuition to happen in English and students to study in English, with neither the teachers nor the students actually speaking English, which causes another enormous problem in education. But those things that you mentioned, a colleague of mine in the charitable sector likes to talk about the 3 C's of COVID, conflict, and climate change, are right at the heart of what's now happening to so many people in Africa. And it's not just an East African story. And Ghana, which again in 2017, 18, we would have seen as one of the great success stories of Africa, now finds itself driven very, very quickly into an extreme debt crisis. And prices in Ghana have gone up unbelievably. They're claiming inflation this year of only 37%, but in practice, it's probably much closer to 98%. Certainly, if you look at prices of petrol and diesel in Ghana, it's gone up by 100% this year. And food up by 122%. And if you think of how central that is, how much of the income of someone in extreme poverty food constitutes, you can see the impact there.
Thanks very much indeed, both of you. Very, very sobering remarks. Maybe I could turn to a question which has been around for some time, but particularly in relation to the countries of this region. And Rory, very involved, of course, in the evolving UK aid strategy over this period, even before the reduction in spending we've seen in the last 2 years. And I wonder in particular whether you have observations about, in this region, what sort of UK economic assistance is most valuable. I sense a shift, even before the turmoil in Ethiopia, away from the UK's traditional focus on social sectors, on education, primary health, cash transfers, which Rory's very involved in now, and putting more emphasis on building the private sector, looking for new opportunities for supporting a private investment, the reform of the telecom sector in Ethiopia, very central to all that. So am I right in identifying that shift? Is that the right shift in terms of the UK's comparative advantage? And are there risks in terms of downscaling those programs which are more directly related to the poorest parts of those countries? Or indeed, maybe Rory's point that it's actually quite difficult to reform the education sector in isolation. So just any observations on the nature of the UK's aid in this region would be most interesting. Rory, why don't you start?
Yeah, I'll start and then hand back to Mary. So I think that the first thing is that at the heart of the problems with the aid sector in general is a sense of despair, a lack of hope. people have been talking about ending extreme poverty for many, many decades. And as I say, the number of people, the absolute number of people in extreme poverty in Africa has in fact doubled since 1980. And that has caused a big, doubt. And there was reason to be doubtful, because many of the ways in which development has been done over the last 60, 70 years has frankly been extremely inefficient and wasteful. However, I think the broad elements of what are required for a country to develop are relatively clear. And if the UK is interested in developing these countries, and there are many reasons why the UK should be interested, could make a geostrategic argument for balancing China. You could make an argument in terms of the fact that the growth in global economies should be good for the British economy, and you can make all these arguments around our moral obligation on poverty and climate, and indeed our self-interest in terms of security and migration. So of the three things essentially that countries need are firstly decent governments, secondly some investment in the right kind of infrastructure, and thirdly the inclusion of the extreme poor in the economies of these countries. And of those three, it's only the last which is really able to absorb large amounts of international funding, because reforming governments is very difficult, and even when it's successful, it's a question essentially of consultants and personal relationships. It's not something that costs a great deal of money. Infrastructure is largely being driven by China and multilateral banks, like World Bank, which leaves the question of including the extreme poor in these economies. And that's where I think we are increasingly seeing academic evidence, over 300 academic papers, suggesting that actually cash transfers, direct unconditional cash transfers, can make more difference than almost any other traditional development program. Recent reports from Kenya suggesting that $1 going in gets about $2.40 worth of return in terms of somebody's savings and income over time. So there is actually a real opportunity at the moment to refocus the world, and it is possible for us to end extreme poverty in Africa within our lifetimes. And I think cash will be a very, very big part of that. But the problem is that we're facing a challenge of domestic politics, driven partly by a sense of pessimism about the failures of international development over the last few years, but also an increasing isolationism throughout the United States and Europe, of people giving up on the global dreams of the 1990s, not just in terms of giving up on the idea of globalization and trade, but giving up on the idea of exporting global norms of human rights or global norms of development.
So, Rory, I mean, that's very, very interesting indeed. But am I right in saying that actually in the UK specifically, there has been a shift away from the 8 priorities that you've just championed?
Well, that's largely, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Malcolm. But some of this is just putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, some of this is just the government trying to rebrand aid cuts. I mean, the fundamental reason why those programs are stopping and why people are talking increasingly about cunning stuff they're doing on trade and investment and private sector investment is they're basically trying to reduce the amount of money they're spending. And those latter things are cheaper. And there are also treasury tricks. I mean, we put a lot more money into the Commonwealth Development Corporation because it allowed us to claim that we were meeting 0.7% targets, while at the same time not actually changing the UK's debt position. So that there are various complicated government accountancy tricks which drive a lot of this move towards investment in trade and businesses, as well as a particular conservative right-wing view that the way to end poverty is through trade, not aid. But the truth is that it's difficult to find good investable propositions at the moment. And there are a lot of funds chasing very few projects. And people create new funds all the time. There's a brand new multilateral over $300 million fund that's been launched to huge fanfare, which is supposed to be investing in startups. There were enormous DFID funds of much bigger scales investing at every level: small and medium-sized enterprises, medium-sized businesses, large businesses, trade investment, etc. But very few of these people are managing to find the sweet spot. The ideal sweet spot is that you're able to use taxpayers' money to take more risk and lend money at a lower interest rate than the private sector would do. But in practice, the processes and procurement processes that control international governments and their spending mean they generally have a risk appetite lower than the private sector, and they charge interest rates often higher than the private sector.
Yeah, really very interesting points. Mary, would you like to come back to this issue about the balance of UK aid effort that Rory's been addressing?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Rory on the unconditional cash transfers, especially if they go to women head of households, because they're more likely to spend that money on lifting their families, their children out of poverty and educating them, making them more healthy, feeding them properly. I think a bit like that model where you drill down and you give the money to the individual. When you talk about development aid in terms of social change, gender, all these issues, health, education, unless it's too cumbersome for Britain to do it, but unless it's done on a very sort of focused micro level, I think the money generally just gets wasted or stolen. And I think that this whole kind of investment, public-private partnership model can work. And I think it's unfortunate that quite often Western donors in particular don't really, in some cases, they don't respect or they don't trust the quite extraordinary private enterprise that goes on. In various parts of Africa. They might look very different to Western models, but they do have thriving businesses. And for example, I think one place where UK development has been helpful is we have DP World reforming the port in Berbera in Somaliland, making it into a proper functioning port that will, they hope, eventually compete with Djibouti. And then you have Britain is involved in this road called the Berbera Corridor that goes all the way to Ethiopia. And that is going to open up and allow more people the chance to make a decent living, because they can import and transfer goods across to Ethiopia, and simultaneously you have a group of Djibouti government and a group of Somali business people who are investing in an undersea cable to improve internet access. And what they want to do with the bit that goes to Berbera from Djibouti is they want then to have a cable that goes over land into Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is a place that is not very internet developed. And if Africa is going to catch up, and it has to in terms of the digital connection with the rest of the world, where data is cheap, lots of people might have mobile phones, but data is not cheap in lots of those places, or it's completely inaccessible in a lot of parts of Ethiopia. So I think there are opportunities to invest in quite big projects that will eventually make more people less poor. And another area that can be really tapped into is maritime resources, because you have this incredible coastline which is very rich in maritime resources, and I don't think it's being looked at as closely as it could be.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed for that. So we're now going to turn to Q&A from the audience. We have a lot of really interesting questions in the chat, and I hope to get through all of them, but let's see how we go. So can I maybe start? There's one rather specific Somalia question I don't want to lose, which perhaps Mary can answer, which is from T. Burwell, who asks, with a focus on security, do you believe that a transition to independent Somali security is within sight? Are the recent successes which you spoke about enough to install a genuine sense of confidence, or are parallels to Afghanistan more apt? Mary.
Yeah, that's a very important question. No, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, absolutely an independent, functioning Somali security apparatus is nowhere in sight. And in fact, what's happening now with the emergence of these clan militias who are called the Mawisle, which is based on, they wear sarongs, which are called Mawis in Somali, and they run about with guns and their sarongs, and they're very effective because they've been living with Al-Shabaab and they know where to hunt them and where to kill them and all of that. But what some people are saying, and I'm on board with that, is that arming and providing weapons and feeding these clan militias, if they succeed in driving Al-Shabaab out to a large degree, if they're not properly integrated into the army, which I don't think is possible, it's just going to invite another war in Somalia, which will be clan warfare, because that's always there, and there are always clan battles going on. So that is number one. The emergence of these clan militias and their importance in the current offensive against Al-Shabaab is very much a double-edged sword. Also, the Somali National Army cannot function properly without African Union forces and support from the US and others. There are brigades that are trained by the US and Turkey and other countries that have become extremely effective, these elite forces, and they're really, really good at what they do. But there is, I mean, if you looked at what happened last year when there was a political crisis in Somalia, different sections of the army started shooting each other because they were supporting different political factions. So I really don't think there's such a thing as a united Somali army. And I cannot see, unless you have that, I don't think it can operate without various outside forces alongside it. It's very sad, but I think that's the truth for now, and probably for quite a long time to come.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear answer to that. Let me, so that I can get through the questions more rapidly, I'm not going to address all of them to both of you, but do feel free to come in if you wish to do so. But let's turn to another one, which maybe I could put to Rory first, which is from Ronan Main Prize, who asks, how concerned should we be about the economic and security connections of both China and Russia to several African states? And when we've talked quite a bit about China already, but any thoughts on that, Rory?
Well, the fundamental answer, of course, is yes, that China and Russia are playing an increasingly large role on the continent in different ways. China primarily economically, and I talked a little bit about the way in which China is focusing on particular minerals and rare earths, which gives China a very dominant position now. It now controls 85–90% of the world's key rare earths. And that puts it in a very strong position if we ever got into a confrontation with China in a cycle of the sort of sanctions and counter-sanctions that we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And in Russia's case, it's the increasing use of very, very aggressive militarized groups, such as this private security company called the Wagner Group, which is very close to the Kremlin, which has had particular influence in Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. Some of those states, you've seen citizens actually out waving Russian flags in gratitude to the work that the Russians are doing there. In the Horn of Africa, there's a very, very interesting conversation also, which Mary maybe can talk about, which takes us beyond China and Russia into the forms of standoffs between the UAE and Qatar in the Horn. Some of these ports that we're talking about are now owned by Gulf states. Different Somali states and factions are funded by different Gulf states. And one of the reasons why these wars continue is that they are often proxy wars. And then, of course, people have raised the issue of Turkey. Mary's talked about Turkish training for troops in Somalia. We can talk also about the extraordinary interventions of Turkey and the Gulf and what's happening in Libya, if we move further north. And that's relevant because the Libyan economy was traditionally very connected to the economies of the Sahel. I think it's very difficult to understand how Mnangagwa took over or sustains power in Zimbabwe without understanding China's position. And I was very struck in the Kenyan inauguration. I was at Kenyatta's second inauguration as a British minister. So that was, the last electoral cycle 4 years ago. The incredible deference paid to a relatively low-level visiting Chinese official at that inauguration. And that's because, frankly, China is able to offer extraordinary things. In that case, able to offer an entire railway linking Mombasa to Nairobi, which nobody else was in the business of providing. So this is relevant, very, very relevant to US Africa policy. I mean, China's right at the heart of the way that the National Security Council and President Biden think about Africa. And it should be at the center of the way that the United Kingdom thinks about Africa. But as I said, unfortunately, what the United Kingdom does is it has talked a good language about balancing China and Africa. But if you look at the actual investment of staff and resources, it's involved a dramatic shift away from Africa in the last couple of years.
Thank you very much indeed, Rory. Mary, could you maybe pick up that point Rory mentioned about the involvement of Middle Eastern states in this region, UAE, Turkey, and so on? And how significant do you think this is? And is it generally positive or negative?
I think it's hugely significant. And it's almost like there's a scramble for power, a different scramble for power going on across the continent. And I think it probably upsets the West because they used to have this kind of dominance in terms of trying to influence politics and all sorts of things, change society in Africa. And it was a pretty patronizing approach. And now there's just massive choice. When you look at the Gulf states, I think it's really important now with the Horn of Africa area we're discussing to look at it as a wider Red Sea, that whole zone. Like, don't think of the countries across the Red Sea as separate from that, because it's just an area that's growing, that's developing. And the role in politics that's played by Qatar, Turkey, UAE, etc. I mean, that is a kind of direct reflection, especially during that big row between Saudi, the UAE on one side and Qatar on the other. And you'd see like the former president of Somalia, Farmajo, he was supported. He was in Somalia, the presidents and the MPs, it's an auction, they buy votes. So Qatar gave a huge amount of money that was used to buy votes. Now it's another president and he's got money from other sources. So you see it's just money that's flown in. Mogadishu shuts down when a plane arrives from one of these countries and it just is trucking money to the presidential palace. So that can't be a very healthy way to conduct politics. I think the role of Turkey is more interesting. It does do some of that in terms of politics as well. But when you look at Turkey, partly in Ethiopia, most dramatically in Somalia, after the first famine of the 21st century in 2011, when a prime minister at the time, now President Erdogan, went there, Turkey did something revolutionary for Somalis, because they went there onto the ground, and maybe they didn't invest vast amounts of money, relatively speaking, but they did so many visible improvements to especially in Mogadishu. They set up schools, clinics, they fixed the roads, they brought over rubbish collection trucks and cleared up quite a lot of the garbage. Sadly, that isn't working anymore, but they developed this relationship with the community that was completely different. Partly, I think there was a Muslim brother affinity, but Somali said, look, the Turks don't treat us as if we're beneath them. We are literally there. They see us as their brothers and sisters, and it felt very genuine. And because of that, Turkey is now reaping the rewards, because in Somalia and also Ethiopia, they're quite likely to hire Turkish if they need an architect, or they need quite a lot of other services and skills. They will look to Turkey. And also in terms of goods coming in, so people say the goods that come from China are cheap and completely rubbish. The goods that come from places like the West are good, but too expensive. And Turkey provides reasonably priced goods that are of a pretty good quality. So Turkey, it got a lot of diplomatic dividends by what it did at the beginning. And now they have, the way they're perceived in many of those countries is, I think it's a more balanced, healthy relationship. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's very, very interesting to see what they've done on the ground in some parts of the Horn of Africa. And I'll just end this thing quickly by saying Eritrea is another very interesting example, because it used to be close to Qatar. And then when the Yemen war came along, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, basically, they took over the port of Asab, and they used that port to lob missiles into Yemen, because it's just 30 or 40 kilometers across the sea. And people in Asab complained. They were like, we can't even sleep because it's just a constant barrage of missiles taking off. So you can see very, very dramatically how those Gulf states have sort of altered the politics, and also given a place like Eritrea a lot of confidence to just carry on with its particular governance system, because it doesn't really matter if the Americans and others don't like us. We have so many other options now.
I mean, it's Malcolm, it's slightly sort of sinister return to a much, much older period, because of course you would have had slightly different names, but very similar conversations going on. If we'd been talking about, for example, South Sudan during the 60s and 70s, where you would have the CIA suddenly involved, the Libyans suddenly involved, the Egyptians involved, obviously the Sudanese involved, but you'd also have the Israelis involved. So there were Israeli units operating, Mossad operating in South Sudan, because they were hoping to tie down Sudanese troops who would otherwise provide support for Egypt against Israel. So these incredibly complicated geopolitical games and proxy wars now re-emerging, as Mary's saying, with the involvement of the Gulf states. And we can now see the period of the 1990s and 2000s as an odd exception, a period basically of American hegemony, where other states up to 2005 were not wealthy or confident enough to get involved in these games, and where there was a bit of a consensus about the way in which economies would function and political structures were supposed to function in Africa. All of that's been blown up, and there's nowhere that seems more, to use the horrible jargon, multipolar than Africa. And of course, multipolar, when it comes to poorer, more vulnerable countries like Eritrea, Somalia, or South Sudan, is generally not a very pleasant thing at all. Multipolar usually means outsiders funding one group against another, or one politician against another.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. So we have a question from Tevelde Adhanom, who asks, what would you comment on the silence of the UK on the Tigray war? And maybe to expand that, would it be right to say the UK really hasn't had much influence at all, but on the descent of Ethiopia into conflict and the failure to reverse that?
Can I come in very quickly? Because Mary will, I'd love to hear her on Tigray and Ethiopia, because I think that's something that people haven't spoken about properly, and to tell us what's been happening over the last couple of years. I mean, the fundamental underlying truth is that not just UK, but even US influence has diminished to very little. I mean, very striking how little progress the US made on Ethiopia, how very little progress the US made on Sudan. But Mary, over to you to tell us what's happening with Ethiopia over the last 24 months.
Mary?
Yeah. What's interesting about Tigray and Ethiopia, because there has, as we well know, it has been in many ways an ignored humanitarian. Well, the humanitarians are trying to do what they can, but it's so difficult to get access. And diplomatically, the US has been, especially Blinken and others, they have been doing some work on this. And what I find quite interesting is, as somebody who's well connected with the different sides in Ethiopia, quite often I'll get them saying to me, like, and the same happens as well in the Somali context. They're like, please, 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 can you speak to your friends or acquaintances in the British diplomatic community and ask them not so much to try to help us directly, but please, can they talk to the Americans and say, if, you know, we need you to try to end political and violent crises in this region still. And I mean, this is, I don't know how genuine, how real this really is a thing that matters, but in Ethiopia, quite a lot of people there, they're like, actually it's the Americans who can try to force some kind of peace between the different parties. So at least in people's minds, the UK is a kind of path into the US, and then US is perceived anyway as a place that has influence.
Sorry, I'm taking poor Malcolm's job, but could you just give us a bit of a snapshot of what's actually happening on the ground in Ethiopia? Forget their fantasies about America's ability to fix everything. What's happening? I mean, what does it feel like in Ethiopia at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Tigray, so there has been this peace deal between the federal government and the Tigrayan, the TPLF, but there are still other forces in Tigray. Eritrea is there. Amhara special militias are in there. And as a journalist, it is a nightmare trying to cover what's going on in Ethiopia because of communications are nearly impossible. People are frightened. We're not allowed to go to Tigray. From accounts, especially like the BBC has got a Horn of Africa service, it's got a Tigray service, a Oromo service, and an Amhara service. They're new and they've been it's been very difficult for them, but they've been absolutely invaluable. There's still, from what they say, that both the Eritreans and Amhara and others are still conducting human rights abuses. They're conducting mass arrests, and even some ministers in the Ethiopian government who people I know speak to them in a sort of when they're very relaxed, and that their language is like, we have to exterminate the Tigrayans, and that is a kind of core driver. So even if we make peace with them, while the world is not really watching, we will try to exterminate especially the leadership. So, and then you do have now some humanitarian access granted in terms of medical and food supplies, but it's very, very limited. And sometimes it feels a bit like a show by the Ethiopian federal authorities, so they can send the photos of the trucks going in and things like that. But the amount that's needed compared with the amount that's arriving, the gulf is absolutely massive.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. And I assume you agree with Rory's characterization of the prospects of American intervention as a fantasy, or do you? Do you think there is something, if the United States only decided to do so, that it could do and to significantly change things?
I mean, they're good at issuing statements. How much they've been involved behind the scenes of this African effort by the former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, and then, in fact, the more effective former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta. It's hard to say, but I don't think that they are entirely uninterested in what's going on in Tigray.
Right, thank you. So we're drawing towards the end. One of the things that struck me in our conversation so far is that we've talked very little about Kenya, except I think Rory made a remark earlier on about, or was it Mary? I apologize for not remembering that Kenya was its stability may be affected. I think it was Mary actually, wasn't it? Kenya may be affected by the what's happening in Ethiopia, but this relates to a couple of questions we've got in the chat, really, which from Mark H and also from Ian Brewster, who were really saying, can you identify one single thing that the UK could do, which it's not doing at present, to really help the process of development in this region? And I'd be interested in your thoughts about what it could do in relation to Kenya as the country which doesn't have the dominance of conflict in its current situation.
So Kenya is a very, very interesting case because it's not somewhere, as I say, like Rwanda and Ethiopia, that has been defined by a famously sort of pro-development elite. Its governance structures have often been perceived as ineffectual and corrupt. But the truth is that it has developed a very, very flexible, resilient market economy compared to most other African states. It is easier to set up a business and make money in Kenya than it is almost anywhere else. And it's got a lot of advantages. It's got a big coastline in its ports, and it can act as an intermediary between the interior of Africa and the coast. It has what William Ruto, the new president, calls the identity of the hustler nation. Very entrepreneurial, very driven. And you feel that by contrast with someone like Malawi, which can, sometimes have a reputation for being a little bit more laid back. It's a big country. It's got a big population almost the size of South Africa, but nothing like the size of somewhere like Nigeria. Population just under 60 million, Nigeria well over 200 million now. I would have thought that the best thing that the United Kingdom could do in a place like Kenya is to try to ensure that the extreme poor are included more in the economic growth. Kenya is well on its way to becoming a proper middle-income country, but if you get up to Lake Turkana in the north, you're essentially looking at gravel plains occupied by nomadic peoples who are destitute beyond imagining. And not very far from, the largest wind turbine investment in the world and extraordinary renewable energy projects and fantastic work on conservation and nature and mangrove swamps. You have people who are amongst the very poorest in the world still in Kenya. So, and, I was in Kilifi about 4 weeks ago, and there, I was walking with a young man with his cattle, and we walked and walked and walked, and it was impossible to find anything for his cow to eat because the drought has been so extreme in its impact. So I would have thought with Kenya, the UK should be focusing on the extreme poor and their resilience, because in fact, the Kenyan private sector is doing pretty well on its own.
Very clear. Thank you very much indeed, Rory. Mary?
Yeah, I think, because Kenya is in this region at the moment, probably the only one you feel quite positive about, there hasn't been enough focus about what Rory's just talked about. Kenya is also affected by this terrible drought, especially in the north and eastern regions. And unless focus is put on communities that are probably, like I was explaining, might well lose their nomadic way of life forever, you're going to increase the divides, and therefore that, already there's been quite a lot of recruitment into Al-Shabaab from Mombasa and people in this ethnic Somali region. And those are often people who are poor and feel marginalized. And I mean, over the past 15, 20 years, the growth of the middle class in Kenya is phenomenal. And I always think that they work really hard, they're really entrepreneurial, and I always think they're doing well despite their government, rather than because their government encourages them, mainly because of things like corruption and other forms of obstruction. Maybe under Ruto, and as Rory said, because he comes from a poor background, and then he's a hustler, and that's his catchphrase. Maybe he will kind of focus more on the poor communities and give them some kind of support, and that's where Britain perhaps could do something intelligent, and so bring more people up into the middle class. And I mean, Kenya is an extraordinary, in terms of its service economy, it's very, very sophisticated, and I think that Kenya could export its service ability more widely than it already does.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary, and thank you, Rory. Thank you both for a really interesting conversation. I certainly learned a lot of thought-provoking ideas, a sense of realism, I think, in terms of the region, and particularly the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia and Somalia. We didn't talk so much about Sudan or South Sudan. But ending, I think, with a sense of real opportunity in relation to Kenya. And I think probably we all agreed that the UK has lost its way in the last couple of years, in particular, most of all in terms of levels of ODA and the unpredictability of UK aid flows. But hopefully that can be addressed and really needs to be addressed. So thank you both so much. It's been fantastic. I hope our audience will join me in a virtual round of applause for you. And thank you, and look forward to seeing you again soon.